On October 22nd, 1837, a 20-year-old aspiring philosopher sat down to write the first ever entry in a new journal. Inspired by a close friend named Ralph Waldo Emerson, the young man hoped that this new routine would also mark a bright new chapter in his life. "What are you doing now?" he wrote. A question which was both a response as well as a repetition of the very same query posed to him earlier by Emerson. "Do you keep a journal?" "So I make my first entry today." The writer of this brief and somewhat paradoxical journal entry would go on to be thought of as something of a paradox himself. For almost 200 years, he has been one of the most beloved and influential writers in all of American history. His writings concerning human rights, political protest, and the concept and methods of civil disobedience would go on to inspire the likes of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. But today, Henry David Thoreau is best known for building a cabin, living there for 2 years, and writing about his experiences in a book that he probably never really expected many people to read. The world that Thoreau grew up in was chaotic and uncertain, and after graduating college, his future prospects looked bleak from just about every possible angle. The society around him appeared, in many ways, to be on the verge of collapse. American consumers had become increasingly dependent on their employers due to financial uncertainties. And most of Thoreau's early writings were, in essence, just him lamenting the unsustainable work-life balance that he saw his friends and neighbors chained to. Banks had become over-leveraged after lending too much money to unqualified speculators. The U.S. government itself had been growing in scope and power, and spending money at a seemingly unsustainable pace, simply to keep up with its own mounting debts. In 1837, the very same year that Thoreau graduated from college, the bubble burst. Economist Milton Friedman described the Panic of 1837, as it became known, as the only depression on record comparable in severity and scope to the Great Depression of the 1930s. From Thoreau's perspective, things weren't looking good. He wrote frequently of the miserable conditions he saw in the society around him. "Some of you, we all know, are poor, find it hard to live, are sometimes, as it were, gasping for breath. I have no doubt that some of you who read this book are unable to pay for all the dinners which you have actually eaten, or for the coats and shoes which are fast wearing or are already worn out, and have come to this page to spend borrowed or stolen time, robbing your creditors of an hour. The better part of the man is soon plowed into the soil for compost." On top of economic collapse, on top of all of this, Thoreau's own personal prospects seemed doomed. His first attempt at publishing was, by any measure, an undeniable failure. Thoreau's first book, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, was so unsuccessful that his printer soon refused to store the remaining copies and returned them to the author. He observed, "I have now a library of nearly 900 volumes, over 700 of which I wrote myself. Most people today think of Thoreau and Walden as a story about detaching from society. A story about living like a hermit in the woods. Thoreau wasn't actually trying to write a book about living entirely independently. That was never actually what he set out to do. What Thoreau really wanted to explore, living by the shore of Walden Pond, was a concept that he referred to as living deliberately. And that message, as it happens, is actually far more relevant to the world we live in today. Thoreau's early life was marked by uncertainty. He felt adrift and unsure of what his purpose was, and he observed the civilization around him becoming increasingly corrupt, materialistic, and detached from anything that really mattered. Eventually, his dissatisfaction became so evident that even his close friends began encouraging him to do something radical. In 1845, Ellery Channing, a good friend and member of the philosophical movement known as Transcendentalism, advised Thoreau, "Go out, build yourself a hut, and there begin the grand process of devouring yourself alive. I see no other alternative, no other hope for you." I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discovered that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was no life. Living is so dear, nor did I wish to practice resignation unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life. This quote has become quite famous, and you've almost certainly encountered it before, at least in part. But it's notable that those quoting Thoreau tend to stop there. I almost never see the remainder of the passage quoted, though it gets to an even more interesting and odd wrinkle in Thoreau's thinking. He continues, "I wanted to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms. And if it proved to be mean, why then to get the whole and genuine meanness of it, and publish its meanness to the world. Or, if it were sublime, to know it by experience, and be able to give a true account of it in my next excursion." Thoreau wanted to strip his life down to only the essentials. He puts this in dire, combative terms, speaking of routing non-life like some kind of enemy army. I think this elaboration to the famous quote is kind of crucial, because Thoreau is explaining what he ultimately means to do by living deliberately. He's explaining his core thesis. Anything beyond the essentials in life requires careful scrutiny and decisive justification. Basically, if you don't actually need it, then it really ought to earn its place at the table. Whether you're fulfilling your core needs or whether you're simply relaxing and passing the time, just make sure that your activities are deliberate. Thoreau lived in a small cabin at Walden Pond for 2 years. Built by Thoreau himself, it was bare bones and minimalist to an extreme, even for the time. Inside was a bed, a writing table, and a fireplace. The whole project cost him $28.12. As Spartan as his daily routine may have been, Thoreau never intended to be any kind of hermit. He conducted business in town. He took his laundry back to his mother's house for washing. and he regularly entertained guests at his cabin. One could easily make the case that Thoreau was simply a minimalist, well ahead of his time. It's a tidy and largely accurate argument that gets across most of his message. But simply describing Thoreau's message as practice minimalism still misses one key component: Thoreau's obsession with time. Recall that very first journal entry, questioning the act of taking the time to write in a journal from the first moment he sat down to do it. Thoreau brought that mindset to almost everything, always scrutinizing his habits and questioning how he was spending his time. There were times when I could not afford to sacrifice the bloom of the present moment to any work, whether of the head or hands. Sometimes, in a summer morning, having taken my accustomed bath, I sat in my sunny doorway from sunrise till noon. Amidst the pines and hickories and sumacs, in undisturbed solitude and stillness, while the birds sang around or flitted noiseless through the house, until, by the sun falling in at my west window, I was reminded of the lapse of time. My days were not days of the week, bearing the stamp of any heathen deity, nor were they minced into hours and fritted by the ticking of a clock. I love the expression he coined there, the bloom of the present moment. It feels like a very Buddhist sentiment. It seems relevant to include one of Thoreau's most famous quotes here. You've almost certainly seen this one before. Why should we be in such desperate haste to succeed, and in such desperate enterprises? If a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. Let him step to the music which he hears, however measured or far away. It's a timeless quote, even taken out of context, but I think it's best paired with a few of Thoreau's thoughts in the concluding chapter of Walden, where he explains his reasoning for ultimately leaving Walden Pond. It is remarkable how easily and insensibly we fall into a particular route and make a beaten track for ourselves. I had not lived there a week before my feet wore a path from my door to the pond side. It is true, I fear, that others may have fallen into it, and so helped to keep it open. The surface of the earth is soft and impressible by the feet of men, and so with the paths which the mind travels. How worn and dusty, then, must be the highways of the world. How deep the ruts of tradition and conformity. I love this quote because Thoreau is expressing a profound and timeless truth. It's very, very easy for us to fall into routines, like a walker on a well-worn path. And it's even easier when countless feet have worn down that path ahead of us. In fact, I've heard modern neuroscientists use this exact same metaphor and language to describe how the human brain forms routines, habits, and addictions. Living deliberately, at least in my interpretation, isn't simply about living simply. Minimalism and clutter is only a part of it. There's a good reason why Thoreau was obsessed with time, with how time is spent, how time is measured, and how we observe and take part in its passage. "What are you doing now?" he wrote. Keep the time. Observe the hours of the universe, not of the cars. The cost of a thing is the amount of what I will call life, which is required to be exchanged for it, immediately or in the long run. Above all, Thoreau was terrified of living a life of quiet desperation. I think he was just trying to step back and reevaluate how he was spending his time, the things he was doing with his life. I believe that the mind can be permanently profaned by the habit of attending to trivial things. If we have thus desecrated ourselves, as who has not, the remedy will be by wariness and devotion to reconsecrate ourselves and make once more a shrine of the mind. The lesson that Thoreau seemed to learn was this: stick to that which is essential. But even more importantly, take the time to learn what is essential. Henry David Thoreau's preferred method for making time to think and reprioritize his life was to get outside and spend time in nature. If you'd like to find some inspiration and guidance for getting out into the woods yourself, I wrote a few books for that exact purpose. My latest book, The Joy of Winter Hiking, is all about finding refreshment, restoration, and beauty in nature, even during the darkest time of the year. Links are in the description below. And here's a quote that seems like it could have been written by a Buddhist, by a Hallmark card writer, by some New Age hippie guru, or after all, the world that threw. You must live in the present, launch yourself on every wave. Find your eternity in each moment. And yeah, that last one sounds like it could have been written by a Buddhist, by the writer of some kind of Hallmark card. Thoreau was hip to some timeless wisdom. Soon I realized that I actually already owned 2 copies of Walden, one of which was printed inside of a compendium volume. And Can't improvise for shit. Okay.